Today I'm going to dive deep into the scriptures to ask the question, what is the biblical view of credit cards? There are lots of lay Christians in the world of personal finances who have offered their opinion on whether or not they think the Bible supports credit card use or not. And these well-intentioned advisors are really just missing one piece of the puzzle that drastically changes how we look at credit cards. When I first got into personal finances, I heard lots of Christian advisors teach that the Bible and God hate the use of credit cards. But I was so intrigued by the verses that they chose to use to support that argument that I ended up studying it even for hours and hours before I ended up writing my master's thesis on this exact topic. So today I'm going to show you the data, and we're going to work through the different verses that talk about this in order to answer the question, what does God really believe about credit cards? Usually when Christian advisors are talking about this, they're not presenting it from the angle of does God hate credit cards? They're actually expanding it to this topic of debt. They're asking the question, does God hate debt? Now I can totally understand why advisors look at particular verses and make the conclusion that God hates debt altogether. But once again, they're simply missing one step of the puzzle that's going to bring clarity to the question about whether or not God hates debt. These advisors often point to verses like Proverbs 22 verse 7, which teaches that the borrower is slave to the lender. Here Solomon is teaching that when we take out debt, it changes our very identity. That we're no longer free people as it relates to the person we borrowed from, but we're now in fact slaves to them. These advisors will also point to the fact that there is not a single positive example of debt in the Bible. And this is true, but here's what these advisors are missing that totally changes our perspective on debt. That these advisors are missing the fact that there's a difference between the biblical culture of debt and our culture of debt today. The problem is that these advisors are trying to understand the scriptures, the words themselves, without understanding the culture in which they were written. And this has really led to all sorts of different faulty applications in the Christian world today, where we just assume that the biblical culture regarding a certain topic or conversation has to be one-to-one to ours. In his book, Misreading Scriptures Through Individualist Eyes, E. Richards says this: when we project our own cultural mores, our own cultural norms, onto the original audience of the Bible, we may fail to apply the Bible correctly in our own lives. And this is exactly why I'm making this channel in the first place. Because we have assumed for years that when the Bible teaches something about money, that it is said in a culture that is exactly like ours. The reality is that there are massive differences between the biblical culture of money and our culture today. And simply understanding the biblical culture of money helps us to put into context the words that Jesus himself and the apostles wrote about money. And when it comes to the cultural differences regarding debt between the biblical times and our time today, the biggest difference has to do with what we spend that debt on. You see, in the biblical times, debt was spent on absolute necessities. That people entered into debt in the biblical times when their lives were at risk. Debt was never perceived in the same way that it is today, as something that's used as a tool to purchase things on a daily basis. Debt was entered into with a lot of fear, because any sort of debt that you would take on from any sort of borrower would really quickly lead to either imprisonment or even slavery. And when we look at the biblical culture around debt, as well as other writings that were written in the same time, we see that debt was used to abuse others in order to secure social status. Debt wasn't spent haphazardly or flippantly. It was entered into with lots of hesitation, fear, worry, and anxiety. But today in 2026, the way that you and I spend debt has nothing to do with life-saving necessities. It has to do with luxuries and comforts. It's the difference between a 2016 Honda Accord and a 2026 Honda Accord. It's the difference between going out to eat every night of the week and cooking at home. It's the difference between buying furniture off of Facebook Marketplace and going to Pottery Barn. The way that our culture looks at debt is nothing like the biblical culture of debt. While they spend their debt on life-saving needs and necessities, we spend our debt on luxuries and comfort. And when you really get into the culture of debt in the biblical times, it's easy to see why God hated that form of debt. Debt was wicked. It was evil, it was abusive, it was even deadly for those who took it on. But simply put, it is not comparable to our culture around debt today. So to answer our question easily, does God hate debt, whether it's credit cards or mortgages or car loans? The simple answer is no. That while God hated the wicked, evil, abusive form of debt that was utilized in the culture of the biblical times, that is not our culture today. But there is still so much that the Bible teaches about credit cards, and I don't want to miss these verses either. And so we're going to dive into the spiritual problem of credit cards. But I don't know if you've ever tried to Google verses about credit cards, but you're not really going to find any content. I mean, it's not like the disciples were gandering about Galilee with their American Express. But it would be wrong for us to assume then that the Bible doesn't teach anything about how we use credit cards here today. Because while the Bible doesn't address the surface issue of credit cards, it actually deals with the more concerning stuff, the heart behind the use of credit cards. The Bible has a lot to say about materialism and focusing on the temporary and discontentment and patience, all of which inform the way that we would use a credit card. I think about verses like Ecclesiastes 7:8, which says that the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. And verses like 1 Timothy chapter 6, which teach that godliness with contentment is great gain. When Solomon teaches about patience in Ecclesiastes, we can readily apply this to our credit card use by simply acknowledging that, man, a lot of times when I want to swipe that card, it's because I'm not willing to be patient. We're not willing to say, I want this thing, let me wait and save up what I need to purchase it with the cash that I actually have. Similarly, when Paul's teaching in 1 Timothy 6, this idea of being content, we can easily apply this to our credit card use as well. So much of our overspending on a month-to-month basis goes to things that we just don't need. We have this root of discontentment in our hearts, and we believe that if I purchase this thing or if I buy this thing, then I'll be content. And this root of discontentment is so often the reason why we struggle with finances as Christians. That we're not content in our relationships with the Lord. We're not content with the good things that He's already given us. And we have believed the lie that if I simply buy this one more thing, then life will be bliss. So the Bible teaches a lot about our use of credit cards, but none of these verses actually prohibit us from using a credit card. They just prohibit us from misusing or overusing our credit cards. Now, what the Bible does prohibit us against is not paying back what is due. Psalm 37:21 says that the wicked borrows but doesn't pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives. That there's a clear distinction here between those who are godly and righteous and those who are wicked. And the differentiation between these two is whether or not we pay back what is owed. If you're enjoying this content and you want to see more of it, you can subscribe below and I would just love to see that. So here's a simple question. What are we supposed to do about this? So every Christian is going to end up having to come to their own conclusion about the use of credit card debt. If you're somebody who's not able to withhold yourself from the temptations of materialism and discontentment, then maybe not using credit cards at all is a great idea. And none of us should have a problem if an individual decides that, you know what, it's not wise for me to use a credit card. But what I take issue with and want to bring clarity to is when people teach that God hates credit cards. My conclusion for my thesis was that there's nothing wrong, biblically speaking, with the use of credit card debt. If you can use a credit card with wisdom and with patience and without being materialistic and discontent, there's actually not a single verse in the Bible that's going to tell you that you're wrong for using it. And if you're in that spot, I would even encourage you to use credit cards. That if you're somebody that's wise and patient and not discontent or materialistic with the way that you use a credit card, it actually brings great rewards to you every single year. Being able to go on vacations for free, being able to travel for free. When our culture rewards us for these godly characteristics, I see no problem with taking advantage of it. But there is a huge problem when we carry credit card debt from one month to the other. The Bible teaches us to not be one of those who gives pledges, who put up securities for debts. In other words, don't be someone who takes on debts. If you have nothing which to pay, why should your bed be taken from under you? The wisdom that we see in this verse is that if you're using credit cards in such a way that creates risk for yourself and for your family, why enter into it in the first place? Debt is like fire. It can either be a tool that we use to cook with and to provide warmth with, or it can be something that totally destroys everything that we know. And this takes intentionality. Our entire culture is built on this idea that I can use debt to get whatever I want, whenever I want. We're used to just living in debt where everything that we own is paid for with monthly payments. And if we want to be people who use debt and use credit cards in a way that honors the Lord, we cannot be conformed to that pattern of this world. Now, if this biblical commentary surprised you based on what God actually teaches about credit card use, you might be interested to know what God actually says about the Roth IRA. So click here and I'll see you there.